Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Clark. I'm a Human Resource Officer at the Learning and Development Directorate, the Ministry of the Public Service, and would like to welcome you to our webinar titled, Understanding the Competency Framework. At this time, I'd like to introduce to you your presenter. Your presenter is for this webinar is Ms. Marianne Wood, Deputy Director Acting at the Learning and Development Directorate. Good morning, Marianne. I hope you're doing fine, and I'm now going to hand over the webinar to you.
Good morning, Michael, and thank you for your introductions. Good morning, everyone. It is so good to see all 73 of you here this morning. Thank you for choosing to join us here to learn about what I consider to be a very important topic. Now, colleagues, as we get started, in order for us to optimize this learning experience, I want to ask for your cooperation in a number of areas. Your mic and video have not been enabled, but perchance you realize that they have become inadvertently enabled. I want you to disable them, please, so that we can optimize our bandwidth. I also want to ask you to pause any distractions as much as possible. Try to focus on the presentation. Reflect on your own experiences. Participate in the chat, or just think through your particular situation as I go through the information. And finally, share what you learn. Not only here, but with other public officers so that the public service as a whole benefits from today's session. So as we continue, let's talk a little about how things have changed over the year. And by talking, I mean I want you to post your comments in the chat window. So, computer analyst Alan Kay is quoted as saying, technology is anything that wasn't around when you were born. So having said that, in the chat, list one piece of technology that did not exist when you were 10 years old. Some of us may have to think a little further back than others, but there's one caveat. Do not use Zoom. I see smartphone, flash drive, tablets. Sam Green is saying cell phone. Blanches is saying tablets, wireless headphones, electronic carriers. That's true. I'm looking forward to the day that I can have one of those. Good. Thank you for sharing, colleagues. Now, as you know, technology changes very quickly. And this COVID-19 environment, smartwatches, I pause, I'm here looking at my iPad as well. I'm just commenting on some of the other things that I see. This COVID-19 environment has taught us how important technology is for staying in contact and achieving the objectives of the public service and, by extension, the country. So let's talk about what we're going to cover this morning. As we move into the substance of our session, here is what we're going to spend an hour or so looking at. We're going to spend some time unpacking the term competency framework. What is it and why is it so important? Then we are going to turn our attention to our Barbados Public Service Competency Framework. Then we are going to spend a bit of time looking at the public sector administration standards. And finally, I'm going to share with you how both the competency framework and the occupational standards can be used to help all of us to develop as public officers. So, meet Jeffrey. Jeffrey Aviator. He's an air traffic controller grade 1. So let's take a journey with Jeffrey as he explores these two HR tools. So now let me make it, I just want to make it abundantly clear. Jeffrey is a fictional character. You know the disclaimer that they make at the beginning of movies or books? Well, the same applies here. If he bears any resemblance to anyone living or dead, it is totally by accident. Anyhow, Jeffrey, as you can see on the slide, is an air traffic controller. He's currently a grade 1 air traffic controller. He has spent the last 15 years at the Civil Aviation Department, where he has worked his way up from an air traffic control cadet. Jeffrey is now preparing himself for promotion. The next step up for him is air traffic control supervisor. He hears about the public service competency framework and wonders to himself, what is this thing? So let's help out Jeffrey and anyone else who might be interested and have the same question. But before, as I said, when I started before we look specifically at our model, let's make sure that we all understand what the term competency framework means. What I should also say is that the competency framework sets out how we want people in the public service to work. It pulls out all of the desired competencies, in other words, for competencies, behaviors, together in one place. So as public officers, we work in a huge range of jobs, from air traffic controller, to clerical officer, to admin officer, to permanent secretary. But there's one thing that we have in common. And that one thing is that we are here to support the elected government through providing advice to help shape its policies, as well as ensuring the seamless and practical implementation of those policies. So a competency framework is a model that broadly defines the blueprint for excellent, note that word, excellent performance within an organization. So when we put competencies together in a model, we are seeking to do what models do, represent concepts and illustrate the relationships between these concepts. So a model, therefore, helps us to understand a particular idea. In our case, the competency framework is the organization of identified competencies into a conceptual framework that enables public officers to understand, to talk about, like we are doing here today, and to apply competencies. So I want you to reflect for a few minutes. Think of the best instructor or coach in your life experience. I can't see you, but I hope you're thinking. Are you thinking? I trust you are indeed. Chances are that the instructor or coach not only demonstrated sound technical knowledge and skills, like he could answer any topic on the subject or could show you how to do anything related to the topic, but that individual also demonstrated a variety of behaviors that made your experience with him or her memorable. So for example, that person, some behaviors that we could identify could have been patient, or caring, or understanding. So think of it. If we could crystallize the behaviors through consensus that make for a good coach or a good instructor, and twin those with technical expertise, and then apply those across all training programs for coaches or instructors, we would have a template for an excellent coach or an excellent instructor. You see, sometimes we focus on the hard stuff, the technical, and forget there are other things that make up competencies. For all parts, both the hard and the soft are equally important. So knowledge of hard technical areas like information technology or engineering, for example, need the demonstration of accompanying soft skills like communication and conflict management to effectively work in an organization. Now I want Jeffrey and all of you who are listening here today to know that over the last 3 or so decades, there has been a focus on competency management, with competency frameworks being one of its major outputs. At last count in 2010, a number of countries in Europe have general competency frameworks that cover their entire civil service. So Australia has something called the APS values. Belgium has a federal competency model. USA has the general competencies for the federal workforce. Some have developed frameworks related to what I'm showing you here for leadership functions, like this one here for the Canadian government leadership. That's called the Canadian Government Leadership Competency Framework. And you will see in their representation that they have identified 6 central competencies for their leaders: promoting innovation and guiding change, creating a vision and strategy, mobilizing people, upholding integrity and respect, collaborating with partners, and achieving results. Recognize that in their model, there's no beginning, there's no end, there's no hierarchical relationship. This would suggest that all of these competencies are equally important. So we have established what a competency framework is. We can also establish that it functions as a strategic HR tool or a strategic human resource management tool to illustrate the desired behaviors that an organization wishes to develop. In our Barbadian context, through stakeholder analysis, there has been an identification of where the public service needs to go and how we must align our HR practices to make HR management more strategic. So we must therefore align areas like our recruitment, our performance management, our training and development to help us achieve our mission. Note also that a competency framework also distinguishes high performers from average performers. Now, traditionally, public service careers the world over were based on qualifications, exams, and seniority. In a competency-based system, while qualifications still remain important, and note what I said there, while qualifications still remain important, there's also an emphasis on behaviors, on those behaviors that officers should bring to the job. And I will use Jeffrey's story to demonstrate that to you a little later. Now I have a question for you. Now we've talked generally about what a competency framework is. How do you think a competency framework would benefit public officers? Type your answers in the chat for me, please. Thanks, Crystal. Adequate service, matching jobs to skills. Yes, that's a good one. Definitely accountability, better service for sure. Keep them coming. I'm looking forward to seeing them. It increases productivity, yes. It provides an assessment. I totally agree with you, Kay. An assessment tool. And overall, you will get job satisfaction. Here are some of the benefits that I have come up with, and I'll share them with you. Some that you've already identified, and they just keep them coming. It's a fair people management system, and as I go through, you'll see how that comes to be. It provides a better understanding of what, and somebody mentioned that earlier, of what is necessary to achieve high performance at work. Yes, Brenda, smooth succession planning. Yes. Better, or here I have on the screen, better understanding of the organization's mission and their role in the individual, you as public officers, your role in the organization. Greater encouragement for personal development. And yes, Jeanette, definitely the officer will begin to understand his or her role in the organization. So we've looked at the benefits that can be accrued to public officers. Well, let's look and see the benefits that the Barbados Public Service would derive from a competency framework. So how do you think a competency framework will benefit the public service now? Again, type your responses in the chat. You looked at public officers, and now we're looking at, so we looked at employees, and now we're looking at the organization. It would enhance recruitment because there will be a link between what the organization wants and the kind of officers that we're looking to put. Yes. I like that idea, Deborah. Enhance image. For sure. You'll be looking to recruit more professional and train, develop towards a more professional public officer. Greater transparency, reduce duplication, excellence in the delivery of service. Jeanette is onto something that we don't know. And we're going to talk about that a little later when we talk about our mission for the public service. So let's share with you some of the benefits that I have identified there for you. Yes, as King, people will have greater confidence in the public service, most definitely. But some that I have shared here on the screen include the benefits that the public service will derive as a whole, clarity over the objectives that are to be met, and a pathway, a structure to meet those objectives. It would allow the development of a strategic HR, a strategic approach to HR management. Somebody said Andrea says a structured approach to reproducing excellence, similar to what I have here. Thank you, Andrea, and everybody else. It provides a useful way to select, manage, and develop officers. And finally, I have here, which these are all similar to what you would have identified. It allows for a better integration of the organization's requirements and people's characteristics. Good. So we all understand generically what a competency framework is and the benefits that can be accrued not only to the public service, but to public officers as well. So let's go on. Let's turn our attention now to our competency framework, the reason why you've signed up for this webinar. Thank you for your responses, colleagues. You will notice, as depicted on the screen, that our competency framework has 3 clusters of behaviors. And at the intersection, you see the desired outcome, which is directly linked to our vision for the public service. And in case some of you don't know, we have a vision statement for the public service, and it's called the Barbados Public Service, a model of excellence in innovation, service, and leadership. So this graphic illustration, or this representation that looks like a Venn diagram, shows the relationships between these 3 clusters or sets of behaviors. Management cluster, core competency cluster, and the professional competencies cluster. So let's look at the behaviors in this cluster here, the management competencies cluster. And 5 behaviors have been identified for us. Thinking strategically, managing and team working, managing change, choosing and deciding, and knowledge management. These are the 5 behaviors that have been identified for this management competencies cluster. Now, I also want you to know that each behavior has a description for the effective behavior as well as the ineffective behavior. So one behavior at Jeffrey's level for thinking strategically is that an officer should have a good understanding of his role in strategy and delivery of priorities versus the ineffective behavior, which states that an officer is not exhibiting effective behavior if he or she shows limited interest in or limited understanding of ministerial priorities and what they mean for activities in their area. So we've looked at the management competencies cluster. Let's look at the other one, the core competency cluster. When we look at the core competency cluster, we see these behaviors pulled out. We see communication, we see personal development, we see getting the best from others, achieving value for money, and delivering at pace. Now, like in the management cluster, each behavior has a description for the effective behavior as well as the ineffective behavior. So if we use communication as an example, someone at Jeffrey's level should confidently handle challenging conversations or interviews versus being ineffective if he or she is unable to deal objectively with conflicts and disputes when they arise. Pausing for a few minutes, let that settle with you. Now, those behaviors, as I move on, those behaviors in the professional cluster, as the explanation states, are specific to each ministry and closely aligned to your strategic objectives over the next few years. So officers from the Learning and Development Directorate visited almost all of the ministries last year with a consultant and discussed each ministry's strategic priorities for the next few years as a means of identifying its professional competencies. So for Jeffrey, 2 professional competencies for the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport that would apply to him are behaviors like working in close collaboration with stakeholders for the development and promotion of sustainable tourism. Second one is promoting Barbados as a clean and safe tourist destination. So in his job, these are the behaviors that he should exhibit in performing his daily tasks. As he walks around the airport, as he's in the tower, these behaviors inform his task, his aim, his objective as he guides planes safely into our country. For the rest of you, yours will look different if you're not in the Ministry of Tourism. So have a chat at your ministry as they were distributed to all ministries last year. Remember, they have been developed at the ministry level and they identify the competencies that are needed to assist your ministry in meeting its mandate. So here you have it again, the Barbados Public Service Competency Framework with the 3 clusters of behaviors that will ultimately help us achieve our vision for the public service. Remember what that vision is? Excellence in innovation, service, and leadership. That's what we're working towards. We have, in essence, identified the desired behaviors that will drive public sector change and assist in developing a cadre of professional public officers in line with the vision for the public service. Neil will make sure that all ministries are aware of the mission statement for the public service of Barbados. Now, you've heard me speak of Jeffrey's level. It is also useful for you to know that the public service has been grouped into a number of bands according to similar levels of responsibilities across a wide range of job functions as follows. You have band 5, which is the executive leadership band, and that includes permanent secretaries and officers of the related grade. You have band 4, which includes deputy permanent secretaries, heads of departments, and senior technical officers. And those are the bands S3 to S9. You have band 3, which is Z1 to Z16, middle managers, mid-level managers and technical officers. And band 2, Z17 to Z38, non-managerial staff. Take a moment, look and see where you fit into the band. What we are therefore suggesting is that in the management competencies cluster, for example, all public officers should think strategically, but the behavior looks different depending on which band you are in. So the behaviors for thinking strategically for a head of department will look different from that of a clerical officer, and I'll explain a bit more in the next slide. I trust that you've located where you fall in the band. So we've pulled out thinking strategically. Remember that that's a behavior that's been identified in the management cluster. So for the thinking strategically behavior for the management cluster that spells out what we were just talking about, I've juxtaposed the behaviors, the effective behaviors for 2 levels. And these are the levels of the executive leaders and the non-managerial staff. So thinking strategically for an officer at S1, S2, permanent secretaries and those of the related grade, those officers should be able to display a good understanding of all wider social, political, and economic issues that influence policymaking, and they should use this information to underpin strategy, this understanding to underpin strategy. Whereas an officer in a non-managerial band still has to think strategically, but this is what it looks like for him or her. He or she has to be conscious and well-informed about actions and consequences in large organizations. And they have to understand the importance of people, even at the non-managerial level. And they should have a due regard for the part they play as officers in achieving goals. So note the contrast. At one level, one set of officers should be able to influence policymaking and strategy by understanding social, political, and economic issues. And at the other level, officers should understand the importance of people, and they should have a due regard for the part they play in achieving goals at their level. Trust you're still with me. But let's look at Jeffrey, and we're going to use the Barbados Public Service Competency Framework to make linkages for Jeffrey. Remember that we said that qualifications and competencies will now work together? Well, I want to suggest that in tandem with the qualifications order, the competency framework should drive all of the HR processes in the public service. So Jeffrey, having worked at civil aviation for the past 15 years, now needs to know that along with the qualifications that he has for the job, he has to give some thought to behaviors. So just as we identified, he has to think about thinking strategically. What are some of the things that he should pay attention to from those effective behaviors? Managing and team working, managing change, and choosing and deciding. He has to think from the core competency cluster. He now has to give thought to how he should communicate, his own personal development, and another example, getting the best from others. So remember that we said that the Competency Framework is a strategic HR tool. So from recruitment or promotion time, yes, you come with the qualifications, but you will also be assessed against those behaviors. So qualifications and competencies are now going hand in hand. In addition, most of them have already been built into our PRDS system, and we are further aligning training and development to these competencies, but we'll talk a little bit about that a little later in the session. So we have talked through, or we've worked through with Jeffrey information related to competency models. Generally, and we have looked with him specifically at our competency model. He has, and I'm sure you do too, a good idea of where we're going. So let's move on. As we turn our attention to the occupational standards, let's use some questions from Jeffrey to guide our discussion. Jeffrey wants to know, how can I use the occupational standards to develop my competencies in the public service? He also wants to know, can any officer at any level decide to pursue any occupation standard? And another question, he has lots of questions, I know. Another question that he has is, can anyone pursue the occupation standards if he or she or that individual is not in the public service? Now for the rest of you, feel free to drop any additional questions that you may have in the chat, and I will seek to address them in the question and answer segment at the end. Before we answer Jeffrey's question, let's talk about occupational standards and what they are. Now, TVET Barbados developed occupational standards for the public service, which were vigorously vetted for relevancy and accuracy by a working group of your peers. So at each of the 4 levels, a group of persons who occupied the band went through the draft occupational standards line by line, word for word, line by line, and then analyze it as a complete standard to ensure that it reflected the realities of public officers at that particular band. After that was done, another level of quality control was implemented. A separate group of public officers from each of the bands then checked those occupation standards to ensure that they did indeed reflect the realities of a public officer at that band. I've mentioned all of that, but you may be asking, what is an occupational standard? Occupational standards, as I have here on the slide, specify standards of performance that officers or people are expected to achieve in their work, and as well as the knowledge and skills they need to perform effectively. Note, knowledge and skills come hand in hand. And each occupational standard has a number of units. So each unit in that occupational standard has things like the task, what a person is supposed to do, the standard to which they're supposed to do it, evidence guides, and underpinning skills and knowledge, which you will become a bit more familiar as we advertise them more. in the public service. Now I'll go back a bit with you. My mouse has now decided that it's going to play a little with me. I need to go forward a bit. I want you to recognize that rigor and quality assurance were part of building the occupational standards. In addition, I also want to say that it is imperative that the public sector embraces occupational standards as a learning methodology and a qualification. It is a part of our educational system as more and more secondary schools are making occupational standards a part of their curriculum. We therefore, as public officers, have to be more open to this form of education and training. So let's talk a little about how we got there, where we're going. The Learning and Development Directorate, formerly known as Training Administration Division, entered a relationship with TVET in July, this is where I am, in July 2016 to develop occupational standards based on the competency framework that we just discussed. So remember, we're talking about two discrete things. We're talking about the competency framework, and now we've moved to occupational standards. And I've graphically outlined the journey that we took there. You will note that we started, as I said, in 2016. At some point, we became an approved assessment center, and now we are getting ready to deliver two occupational standards. The one for the level 2 officer, which is Z17 to Z38, and the one for the level 3 officer, which is Z16 to Z1. And these two occupational standards get underway towards the end of this calendar year. So the Public Service of Barbados now has 4 occupational standards based on the management and core cluster of the competency framework, as you see here on the slide. I also want you to know that it's a management qualification. So we have, just as we identified the bands earlier, band 5, the occupation standard for that band is Public Sector Administration Level 5. For band 4, it's Public Sector Administration Level 4, and likewise 3 and 2. And they're aligned, as I just mentioned, to the banded areas. So the competency framework identified the behaviors, and the occupational standards are specifying those behaviors into standards of performance so that any learning can be obtained and, most importantly, assessed. So here are the units that make up the occupational standard in public administration for Jeffries level, which is Z16 to Z1. We have, so the units, remember we said a number of units make up one occupational standard. So the units are, you need to know how to manage yourself, and you'll be taught, you learn, you'll go through content in managing yourself in the public sector, encouraging and developing teamwork in the public sector, applying knowledge management in procedures in the public sector, plan, implement, and manage change, manage resources to achieve value for money, utilizing change management procedures, communicating, we identified that, we pulled that out as a core competency in the competency framework, and an area that is included in all of the standards. You must be able to comply, or you must know about the legal, regulatory, and ethical requirements in the public sector. And that's an advantage that the occupational standard has on academic qualifications. This professionalizes the public officer. You get to go through content specifically related to our Public Service Act, our qualification framework, our financial rules and regulations, our constitution. So anybody that does an occupational standard gets information specific to management, but with some specificity to the rules and regulations that make up the public service. And you know that we are a rules-bound organization. And please note that in due course, information on these units for each level will be placed on our course website, just as we now have the competency framework on the website. And towards the end of this session, we're also going to drop in the competency framework as a link for you to download. So let's take Jeffrey's first question. Jeffrey wants to know how he can use the occupational standards to develop his career in the public service. So as I mentioned earlier, to advance to the next level of air traffic control supervisor, Jeffrey needs to have 3 years experience as an air traffic controller, 1, which he already has, and the other technical qualifications, which he also has. In addition, this is the difference now, he needs to have a diploma or a certificate in management, and he does not have this at this point in time. So in time to come, Jeffrey, in consultation with his supervisor, can have a discussion about taking the occupational standard at level 3. The occupational standard will allow him to meet the qualification requirements for a higher post. Right now, in the qualification order, it speaks about having a certificate or diploma in management. This can also be used to allow Jeffrey to meet the qualification requirements for that post of air traffic control supervisor. Note also that the occupational standard can be used to help Jeffrey's performance on the job. So let's say that he and his supervisor agreed at a progress meeting that he needed to work on the area of communication. Jeffrey could be recommended for training to pursue that particular unit. So we have identified how Jeffrey could be helped with the occupational standard for promotion or with performance management. Let's take another one of his questions. With reference to number 2, training is required to help an officer to do his current job or prepare him for the next possible role, particularly if he acts in the higher post from time to time. So no, Jeffrey or any other public officer cannot decide on his own right now to pursue training at 2 or more levels above. So let's say, for example, let's use Jeffrey. Jeffrey's at level 3. Jeffrey can't decide on his own that he wants to take the occupational standard at level 5, which is for the permanent secretary grade. Let me explain that a bit further for you. As part of gathering evidence to gain the certification, the officer must demonstrate, remember, it's not only knowledge, the officer must demonstrate competence in the area. So in order to demonstrate competence, there must be opportunities to practice skills. So Jeffrey would find it extremely difficult to find evidence, for example, that he can maintain financial controls and systems. This is an area for the PS band, if he's never required to do it at his current level. So occupational standards are a little bit more than gaining knowledge or acquiring knowledge. They also have embedded in them the demonstration of skills. So you must demonstrate that you know how to do particular tasks. Can't stress that enough. Acquisition of knowledge and demonstration of skills. So let's look at Jeffrey's third question. So Jeffrey is wondering if he should get his nephew, who is at home right now, to help to take one of these qualifications to help him to get into the public sector. So he asks, can others pursue the occupation standard if they are not in the public service? Unfortunately for Jeffrey, this is a qualification for public officers. In addition, the Learning and Development Directorate is the only approved center for this standard, and our mandate still only applies to public officers. So sorry, Jeffrey. So when we take the occupational standards and we take the competency framework and we put them together and all of this coalesces, this is what we're working towards. a Barbados public service that is a model of excellence in innovation, service, and leadership. And we need this now even more than ever. So I'm encouraging you to grab a hold of that vision. Have a look at the competency framework. Have a look at the occupational standards to see how together we can drive this public service that we are all a part of. I'm going to turn to Michael now for question and answers.
Thank you, Marianne, for that very informative and awareness-raising presentation. Now, as promised, we will now facilitate a few questions from you, the participants, and I would like you to place these in the chat if you have not done so as yet. While we're waiting to do that, Marianne, we do have a question here from a Y Walcott, Dennis. And the question is, persons at band 4 and 5 have the greatest impact on the service. Where will the occupational standards be administered for level 4 and 5? I'm assuming that should be when. Are they asking when or if?
We all have an impact. We started with, thank you for your question, Michael. We've started with bands 3 and 4. It's a timely process. And by next year, we should have bands, we started with bands 2 and 3. And by next year, we should have bands 4 and 5 up and running. We're doing it step by step, baby steps by baby steps.
Okay, I hope everyone pulled away what Marianne was trying to say from that reply. Not seeing many questions coming in. Seems we're pretty comprehensive. There's one popping in from Andre. If I have a professional qualification, how can that be evaluated?
And I'm assuming that Andre, I'm assuming that that's an academic qualification. As long as it meets the requirement for the particular post that you are looking to work towards, there's no need for it to be evaluated, Andre. So the occupation standard is something a little different. Your professional qualification, if I'm understanding you correctly, still stands as it is. The occupation standards are an addition. They are a different route for individuals who want to pursue something different.
Yes, that is correct. We have one here from David Alcott. For new officers entering the service at any band, when and how will they initially interact with the occupational standards?
Remember we said that it's an HR tool, it's a strategic HR tool. You can interact with the units in the standards for performance management. So as I said, you can have a conversation with your supervisor, and if through agreement, you've identified that there's an area that you need to refresh, to enhance, your supervisor can make a recommendation for you to pursue a unit or the standard.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne. I think we're going to take one more question. It's from Valerie Francis, and she says, if one fails in a competency area, is there a time frame to work on it, or would help be provided?
There's no failure in competencies. When we talk about occupational standards, you are deemed competent or not yet competent. So there is no time limit in pursuing an occupational standard. You work at it. You work at it until you have been deemed competent. So let's say so part of an occupational standard is the submission of a portfolio. So let's say that you submitted a portfolio for one area that we identified, communication. You undertook the training, you submitted a portfolio for the unit, communication. If perchance, in going through your evidence of the knowledge that you have acquired and the abilities or the skills that you have in communication, the assessor deems you not yet competent, you are given the opportunity to go back and fill in those gaps. As I said, the standard will have all of the areas in which you need to be competent. So there's no failing in competencies. You work at it until you are competent.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Do we have time for one more question or?
We have time for 2, 3, 4 more
Okay,
questions,
2, 3
Michael.
more. Well, fine then. Okay, so we take one from
Keep
Paula,
them coming.
which asks, does emotional intelligence form part of the framework? I know we know emotional intelligence is one of the new things which people tend to associate now with HR practices and being good HR practitioners. So I guess it's a valid question coming in from Paula.
It's not explicitly stated, but communication is part of emotional intelligence. Being aware, let me look at some of the other areas in the core competencies. So in seeking to achieve some of the areas under the core competencies that are developed in the occupational standard, you would be working towards enhancing your occupation, your emotional intelligence. I don't know if that makes it clear. So we identify, for example, that in the core competency cluster, there are areas like communication. I'm trying to find them back here on my sheet. Getting the best from others. And you can only get the best from the others if you understand how to influence, if you understand how to communicate, if you have good interpersonal skills. So all of these are wrapped up in emotional intelligence. So working towards these individual units will give you a great appreciation for emotional intelligence.
Thank you. I hope that answered your question, Paula. It made it quite clear for me. We'll take one more question from S. King, and she's asking, the person is asking, are officers identified for the occupational standards or do the officers apply?
Would you repeat that again, Michael?
Are officers identified for the occupational standards? I would assume she's meaning participating in pursuing the occupational standards, or do officers apply?
Well, it's still part of the training. So we know we have a process or protocol for training in public service. Any training that you remember, we set our definition of training to increase our knowledge and skills in our current post. So any training that you seek to undertake through the Public Service of Barbados, through the Learning and Development Directorate, has to be with the approval of your supervisor. So yes, through discussion, consultation, agreement with your supervisor, you undertake the occupational standard, because the form that comes in, just like all of the other in-service training forms, would have to be signed by your supervisor, the head of department.
Thank you, Marianne. Henderson Patrick, he's asking, is it part of the vision going forward to present these standards as an alternative to the academic qualification, especially for new entrants to the service? You brushed over both of these in your earlier comments, but you can just refresh that information for Henderson.
Yes, Mr. Patrick. In addition, another route. So you can go the academic qualifications route, or you can go, and we're talking in the management stream now, or you can go the occupational standards route. Both are equally viable. Both will be accepted.
Okay, that seems to be it for the questions. So as we get up to wrap up, before we end the webinar, I would like you to reflect on today's presentation and ask yourself, what did you learn today that completed your circle of knowledge? And place your answer in the chat box. We will examine and analyze all of your answers, so be as open and honest in your responses as possible. Okay. And while you're posting your answers, we will upload an article on understanding the competency framework, as well as the competency framework document, which you can download to read at your leisure and browse. So while you're posting your answers in the chat and downloading the document, on behalf of our presenter, Ms. Marianne Wood, our producer, Ms. Joanne Jordan, myself, and the entire team here at the Learning and Development Directorate, I would like to thank you for joining us this morning, and I do wish you an enjoyable and good day. Continue to post, and we'll leave the chat feature open for a few minutes. And goodbye,
So we can
everyone.
see and comment. So we can see and comment on them, Michael.
Exactly, yeah. So we can see and comment on them.
We really want to see what it is that you've gained from today's session.
Seems persons are gathering their thoughts together.
Or busy downloading the article. But I really hope it was useful information.
It
One
is,
that we
yeah. We
can
have
take
some
as we
comment.
go forward. Go
Yep.
ahead.
There's a comment from Neil. I'm already aware of the competency training, but I am now learning of the training to be provided to public officers specific to their job functions. Andre is saying, if I am understanding this presentation correctly, this means that there is another pathway towards upward progression and overall development within the public service.
Most definitely, Andrea.
Yes, correctly.
So you can wrap up as they go ahead and put in Michael.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, they're still coming in. So I'll leave the chat open for 2 more minutes. Those of you who have completed downloading the documents, you could also continue to post your responses to the question, what did you learn today, in the chat feature. And as I said, on behalf of all the entire team at the Learning and Development Directorate, I do wish you a good day and thanks for attending our webinar. Do look out for future webinars we have coming up, and also pay a visit to our YouTube channel where you can listen to a recording of this webinar and also watch those webinars that went previously. Goodbye and good day.